Bienvenue à toutes et à tous. Herzliches willkommen. A hearty welcome to you all. Tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand, where, as you know, the time is 5 o'clock in the morning. My name is Ramsey Margolis, and I'm one of the members of the Tuwhiri editorial board. Now, we are gathered here together for the launch of Winton Higgins' book, Revamp, Writings on Secular Buddhism. And Winton, as you say, the time in Sydney is, Australia is 3 a.m., is that right?
That's right, yes.
Yes. Well, in the early 1980s, when I was working night shift in London's printing industry in Clerkenwell, we would call this the ungodly hour. And one night, over tea and freshly baked sandwiches and bread, we decided that the hour was ungodly because congregations didn't meet at this hour. Now, as someone who is decidedly not a God botherer, I could feel like I could live with that definition of the word. Now, Stephen Batchelor. Stephen, you've read Revamp in manuscript, and you're now going to have a conversation with Winton about the book. I'm looking forward to this. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And when it's just before the next hour, we will open this up for questions. So please put this in the chat. Stephen, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ramsey, for organising all of this. And it really is a great honour and also a great pleasure to be able to have this conversation with my old friend, Winton Higgins. We've known each other probably for about 30 years, I suspect. There was a time back in the 90s when we went to Australia, Martina and I, fairly regularly, and I got to know Winton very well. And has remained a friend ever since, although we haven't really had a lot of actual or even virtual contact outside emails and sharing of manuscripts and things like that. So this is Winton's show, as it were, and I want to minimize my input so that we can hear from Winton and he can tell us about this book of his called Revamp. So let me just start by offering a few very brief reflections on the book itself, and then I'll offer some questions to Winton, and then I suspect we'll just keep that ball rolling in one way or another. Revamp is a collection of essays. It's a collection of transcribed talks. Some essays are much more formally written, others are much more informal, obviously depending on the kind of audience. But what Revamp provides that no other book on secular Buddhism yet provides is a comprehensive overview of the whole phenomenon of what we have come to call secular Buddhism, which is a term that's becoming more and more current. In fact, I just received a PDF manuscript the other day from Shambhala Publications called Secularizing Buddhism. It's a collection of mainly academic essays. I haven't had a chance to look at it yet, but it's again an indicator of how what started out, I think, as a very small minority interest on the very edges of Buddhism is now gaining some traction and some acknowledgement within the wider Buddhist world. And I think it's establishing itself, in other words, and not so much as an institution. In fact, I don't think it's an institution at all, but as a sort of a movement, a tendency, and so forth and so on. So what Revamp does is to, as it were, give us a picture, a kind of collage of different pieces of Winton's own thinking about this movement, as it were, which gives us both a sense of where it's coming from back in the past, a sense of where it kind of is at now, and the various issues that we as secular Buddhists, or whatever we call ourselves, try to grapple with. And also, and this I think is in a sense one of the the greatest contributions of this book, is it looks towards what kind of future we might anticipate as secular Buddhists, and how we may contribute to that future, not just as individuals, but as citizens. And I hope to come back to that question as our conversation continues. But I'd like to start by asking Winton, first of all, could you say something about the choice of title, Revamp? Again, for non-native English speakers, this might not be a word that's immediately clear. And also, just to give us a sense of, what were you trying to do in putting this book together?
Right. Well, there's a wide inquiry right there. Ramsey and I had a bit of trouble getting to the right title. We wanted a one-word title. We started with Refit, which probably is just as weird as Revamp. But Refit, we discovered, was more about boats and ships. And then we had an argument about what the cover would look like, whether it would have a marine vehicle in it or not. And then eventually we arrived at Revamp. But what we're trying to capture there is a kind of reimagining of the Dharma in non-religious terms. So I guess that's what's behind the title. We couldn't think of a better one. It was sort of a question of reductio ad absurdum, I guess, that we came up with that title. And what I suppose I was trying to do was collect the Dharma talks and the essays I'd written over the last 8 years into put them between two covers, but then to try and find a discursive arc, as we say in the trade. Instead of a narrative arc, there's a discursive arc. So I was trying to put them in a developmental order so that we start with emergence, so the where this movement came from, intellectually speaking, and how it came to be there, and then to move on to that, from there, to pick up Western affinities between the Dharma and Western thinkers. And this is a very rich field, because quite a few prominent Western thinkers seem to be saying things that resonate very strongly with a lot of the canonical material that Stephen himself has brought to our attention in his various books. So I hope I've managed to do that. So we've gone from Western affinities to issues to do with wider issues of the survival of the inner life in the digital age, and the problem with the rising level of distraction in our lives. So to defend the inner life itself is quite an achievement. And meditation, of course, is one way to do that. And then I tried to go into what this means for the way we practice the Dharma, and the way we come together, what we know in social or in political sociology as forms of association. Are we to meet as sort of in military style hierarchies, or are we to meet together as individuals who are all on the same level, who all have the same authority in the groups we create? And so there it seems to me that Western civil society is a rather happy hunting ground for secular Buddhists who want to get away from the gender exclusiveness, the hierarchical nature of normal, quote unquote, Buddhist organizations, the way spiritual authority is handed down through lineages, that sort of thing is what we can get away from by just adopting a very common model of how to organize anything in the West, whether it's, a group of stamp collectors or a group of basketball players, or just about any other interest groups. So that seems to me to be not only a happy way for us to organize, but as Stephen has pointed out, this is the sort of grouping or the sort of groups, sort of forms of association that were common among the Buddha's sanghas, his practice communities during his own lifetime, before religious ways took over, and we got the hierarchies and the people at the top of the pyramid and so forth. So that seemed to be really important. And the other great issue for me was to break down this idea that a holy person is always, a sort of Jonathan Livingston Seagull character who is practicing purely on an individual level, or as on an individual level together with others who are practicing on an individual level. So we have a problem. We have not the problem, but the inspiration of the Greek polis, for instance, the ancient Greek polis, which was about people coming together and making and thrashing things out as equals and making decisions on that basis, organizing themselves on that basis. And of course, also producing some pretty classy philosophy. So, so that's essentially the discursive arc I've tried to follow through the book.
Could we maybe think through this tension that I know is something for me, I suspect it is for you too, and that is the word Buddhism itself, as opposed to the word Dharma. And I personally struggle a bit with this. I feel that as long as we are using the B word, Buddhism, we are, as it were, adhering to a body of knowledge, a form of basically a world religion that immediately ignites certain images in our general population as to, what a Buddhist is, and the sort of stereotypes, a caricature almost of a Buddhist who's, is rather sort of dour and sincere and earnest and meditates and believes in reincarnation and so forth and so on. And, no matter how much you might critique that in your books and I in mine, I wonder if there's really any prospect of that broader sense of what Buddhism is, ever really shifting, ever really changing. And I wonder if that, although it has the advantage of being instantly recognizable, it has the disadvantage of carrying with it an awful lot of baggage. And remembering too that the word Buddhism is an invention of the West. I mean, there is no really an equivalent in Asian languages. So I find myself more and more dispensing whenever possible the word Buddhism, and trying really just to go back to the idea of the Dharma. What's your take on that? Where do you stand in that spectrum, as it were?
Well, I labour under the same problem as you do with this. It's a bit of an issue, like how one identifies oneself in different settings. You know, if I meet someone at Central Station here in Sydney and they ask me where I'm from, I'll say Piedmont. But if I meet someone at Heathrow, ask me where I'm from, it doesn't make much sense to say I come from Piedmont because I haven't a clue what that means. They might mix it up with Piedmont in Germany, which is actually where the name came from. So it's a question of where you are and who you're speaking to, I think. There's no doubt that the contradiction is there. But if I'm talking to someone who hasn't the faintest idea of where I stand on anything, Buddhism is a kind of like it's like saying I'm from Australia. It tells nothing. It doesn't say anything to other Australians, but it says something I might meet in Heathrow. So I would love the word Dharma to become universally recognizable, because I would love to go over to just saying secular Dharma. And in fact, you know, the appropriate folders in my computer all say secular Dharma. And they do in my mind, because you know, another way in which this problem comes up is when speaking to non-secular Buddhists. I had this experience a few years ago of being invited to give a talk to a group called the Metta Centre in an outer suburb of Sydney. And these were all very bright, quite independently thinking Asian Buddhists. And I gave my talk and I rather sort of danced around the issue of rebirth. And the very first question I got at the end was, do you believe in rebirth? And I said, no. and then I got a flood of questions saying, well, what's the point? You know, how can you call yourself a Buddhist? And why would you want to practice? Because what became clear is that they were all practicing in order to gain a fortunate rebirth. There seemed to be no idea of Buddhism as practicing Buddhism as a way to flourish in this life. It was all very goal-oriented. So I found that this increased my my discomfort with the whole thing of, you know, branding myself as a Buddhist of some kind, of any kind. But you know, I just hope we can evolve to a situation where we can pick up the word or the title secular Dharma and still be understood, even at Heathrow Airport.
But surely one of the ways to do that is to stop using the word Buddhist. If we ourselves, those of us who are uncomfortable with the word Buddhist, continue to use it, even with strangers in Heathrow Airport, aren't we actually perpetuating the very thing that we're, in a sense, struggling with? Wouldn't it be, you know, equally, you know, maybe slightly provocative, but nonetheless a way into a conversation if, when the topic came up, we refuse to use the word Buddhist and we talk of ourselves as people who practice the Dharma, which will then lead to the next question, well, what is the Dharma? But at least we've got the conversation off the Buddhist track. So I wonder to what extent, you know, you feel that there's a kind of, you know, responsibility almost if we do think this way, and we feel that Buddhism is too much entrapping us in, you know, the religion of and the Asian religion, to not actually make a more forthright attempt to normalize the word Dharma.
Yeah, but there is still this problem of situating oneself. I mean, for someone who's never heard of the word Dharma, it might sound like a weird sect that we'd invented, but so it's just to get that sense of a general orientation, we seem to be stuck with it. And another a similar conflict comes up with what do we call the Buddha? And I notice that, that I think you and Ramsey and I, to some extent, talk about Gautama. And again, the problem is, I mean, for people who are aware of who Gautama was, that's fine. But, to the chap on the Clapham omnibus, it means absolutely nothing. Who is Gautama? And you say, well, you'd probably know him as the historical Buddha. Oh, so you mean the Buddha, do you? So it's just, we'd be going around in circles, and it might even sound a little bit evasive, to use words like Dharma and Gautama to people who don't know the territory, as it were.
Mm. No, well, I mean, I completely sympathize with that because, and I completely agree with you. I think it is very much context specific, and I have to negotiate on many occasions whether I call myself a Buddhist or whether I don't, or in what way, and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
What I find odd in a way is somehow, trying to put Buddhism at a distance, and yet presenting the Dharma in a way that goes back to what this person, Gautama, who's known as the Buddha, is more likely, in fact, to have taught than what a lot of, formal Buddhist believers would accept. As you know, I mean, in Tibetan Buddhist traditions, Zen also, they don't pay much attention to the early suttas, the early discourses of the Pali Canon. And yet we secular Buddhists, who are supposedly leaving Buddhism behind, are actually probably giving more importance to these early texts than most Buddhists do. I find that as a kind of an odd conundrum to be in. How do you negotiate that one? Well, is that uncomfortable for you, for example? Is that a problem for you as well?
It's certainly uncomfortable, but it's also, so I've got a bit of a cold. It's also a challenge, I think, to what I would think of as conventional Buddhists. So it can lead to some rather interesting conversations. And I'm also thinking of how this works for progressive Christians who want to, scrap all the magic and the superstition from their tradition. I notice that they still call themselves Christians, or a lot of the time they still call themselves Christians, despite the fact that the word Christ probably didn't arise in Jesus's own lifetime, and the Christ that they are worshipping or forming a relationship with doesn't seem to have any particular relationship with the historical or possibly historical character called Jesus. So again, I think they're taking the view that they do want to be recognized or identified as people who trace their tradition back to this historical figure. And so they're not about to abandon a term like Christianity, as far as I know.
Yeah. I wonder if we could move on to the question of community and citizenship, which you develop towards the end of your book. Chapter 13, for example, is called Sangha, the Western Dharma Practitioner's Dilemma. Could you expand a bit on what you mean by dilemma in relationship to Sangha, community?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to, well, the word Sangha is yet another one of these conflicted terms, because if you hang out with Theravadins, the Sangha is the monks. And so, the lay people who hang around the temple are not, they're not in any kind of community. Their community is denied in a way by the monopolization of the term Sangha. But I think that most Westerners who read something about Buddhism think it's quite interesting, think they'd like to give it a shot, would just normally graduate to maybe even the closest manifestation of Buddhism, the temple down the road, or a friend who's, become part of a Mahasi practice group or something like that. And they're immediately confronted with a conception of Sangha, which is hierarchical, which has all sorts of weird beliefs and rituals, and a need to prostrate to certain individuals because they're, at the top of the pyramid in some way. So I think this is what it's about. This is actually, there is no alternative, in Maggie Thatcher's wonderful expression. So it seems to me that if we get back to we're getting back to the original model, as far as we know, in the Buddha's lifetime of a Sangha, it wasn't anything like that. And we are trying to create something that is a flat organization, something that would have been recognizable in the Buddha's lifetime, but not since then. And yet something which is an absolutely normal form of association in our own societies, in Western societies. So once again, we're in conflicted territory here, and we just have to, soldier on through it, I guess.
Another question I think that I've always, when I've read your work and when we've had conversations, I've always been very much aware that your professional work as a professor of sociology, political sociology, is that right? Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Politics, basically.
Politics, okay, we have politics, which is a field that I feel very sort of distant from, to be honest. And I feel also that that's an area that I haven't really, come to terms with in many ways. And so one of the things I very much enjoyed about your book was the fact that that side of your own formation, as it were, feeds through into a rereading of some of these Buddhist texts that I personally don't have. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit both about how that training and background that you have professionally has come to play a role in your interpretation of the Dharma, let's call it, and particularly how it forms the basis for your idea of dharmic citizenship, which is the last part of Revamp, is called dharmic citizenship. And I suspect that's not disconnected from your work as a political scientist or whatever it is. Could you say something about that?
Well, to start off with, my main field was in political theory, and political theory is really about ethics. I mean, ethics, believe it or not, is the bottom line of every political position that one can hold. And so a doctrine like the early social democracy, going back to the 19th century, mainly in Germany, then was very much a moral proposition about the need for inclusiveness and the need for equality. Now, why this is so important, and where there's a very real shift from the early Dharma to where we are now, is that the main risks and miseries that people faced in the Buddha's time came from nature. They came from pestilence, from famine, and all sorts of unfortunate natural events, plus violence. And violence in those days was pretty much a natural event as well. So politics didn't matter. Politics matters absolutely today, because just about all our risks and difficulties come from organised human behaviour. The millions who are dying right now of COVID-19, for instance, are dying because of the maldistribution of vaccines, the maldistribution of oxygen, breathing machines, and so on. And the failure of national leaderships to deal with the pandemic as it should have been dealt with. So, down here in New Zealand and Australia, we've had almost zero deaths. And that was because our leaders made the not terribly challenging decision to follow the medical advice. So all those deaths from the pandemic are really due to failures of political leadership. And then there is the fact that so many people have died through direct government action. On one calculation, 200 million people were killed by direct government action in war, genocide, etc., in the 20th century. So all the diseases that are killing people in the developing world are really about neoliberalism's extremely unequal distribution of medicine, of medical expertise, and of living conditions. People who have no access to clean water, for instance. So politics really matters, and it matters absolutely critically in terms of the two great crises that I identify in my book, which are global warming and the intensifying inequality and social injustice around the globe, in every country, and in every suburb, just about, in the West and again around the world. So, these have been documented and problematized more and more in the last couple of decades, a period in which the effects of neoliberal governance have become more and more pronounced. So politics matters today like it never did before. And so that's why I think it's important for us to go back to that ancient Greek ethic, that what affects the public should be decided by the public in public, by characters called the citizens. And we are, we are citizens, looking around the screen, of democratic or half democratic countries where really the buck stops with us. We elect these hopeless leaders who can't manage the pandemic, who follow economic policies that lead to massive social exclusion and massive social injustice. And the only way we're going to effectively deal with those issues that are ultimately issues of care, of appamada, is by political action and educating ourselves about it. So about 5 hours from now, I'll be joining the school kids strike down in the city, which is one of the most extraordinary kinds of exercises of civic responsibility that one could imagine. Out of the mouths of babes and innocents come words of wisdom, and here they are And so it seems to me that we have to get off our cushions and go down and be with them and be, you know, part of their action.
Well, that's very moving, actually, what you just say, and it resonates certainly with many of my concerns. But it made me also think of a conversation I was having on another Zoom screen a day or so ago, and where I was also talking about, you know, responsibility for the unborn generations in the future and things like this, the crises of global warming and so forth and so on. And one of the participants objected to this. They said, look, I don't want Buddhism to be telling me how to conduct my political life. Buddhism, and this is probably a secular Buddhist of some kind or another, was nonetheless a little bit uncomfortable with the idea that my commitment to the Dharma may then somehow oblige me to be involved in certain political acts. And by that, I think, you know, party political acts of joining some kind of political party of some kind. And I guess that's the uncomfortable edge for some people, is that Buddhism, the Dharma, is a way in which we can withdraw to some degree to a space in which we're not conflicted by political choices, but we find a clarity, a stillness within ourselves that will perhaps give us a better foundation for making those choices. But we want somehow a kind of an apolitical zone in our practice that is untroubled by those things. I mean, how would you have responded to that person?
Well, one point, I guess, that I'm making in that final chapter of the book is that the main game today, when we're dealing with the climate emergency and this intensifying social injustice and social exclusion, the main game is precisely in civil society. You don't have to be a member of a party. You just have to be a member of Extinction Rebellion or you know, some group that is advocating and struggling for refugees, for people in the developing world who don't have clean water or access to you know, the COVID jab or something like that, because this is where the real action is, just as it was in ancient Athens. It's where the people come together in forms of self-mobilization. The problem with one of the arguments in the book is that if you join a political party that you think accords with your views, then the leadership of the political party won't give a damn about what your views are, that they're all part of a political class which is separate from the rank and file membership and really in bed with corporate power. And that goes across the normal political spectrum. So this is, you know, coming from a particular theorist I'm using called Colin Crouch, who's saying we are living in post-democracies because, you know, the high tide of Western democracy was in the mid-20th century, and now it's been overtaken by all the politicians, minders, and advisors, and perception managers. I love that term. And all the vital decisions are made out of the public realm. They're made in private deals behind closed doors, and our going to the polls every 3 or 4 years or whatever it is fine. You know, they have to win the votes, but we're just being conditioned or nudged, a lovely word that these people use. We're being nudged in certain directions. An example of that is in this country, which has, where the government has no interest in climate climate policy. And every time someone says something about the climate, they change the topic. And this is a strategy of marginalizing and trivializing something that is where they have no answers because they are in the thrall of vested interests to do with fossil fuels. So this is, in this way, the party political system is not responding to what the public wants. And so for this reason, the public has to organise in other forms, in pressure groups and mobilisations that are directly around things like social equity and reducing carbon emissions.
I mean, I would love to carry on in this vein, but I realise we're getting to a quarter to the hour, and I feel it's maybe the moment to invite the participants. If you have questions or comments that particularly you would like to address to Winton, this is your time. We've got about 15 minutes or so. So again, probably easiest if you write something in the chat, but if not, you can raise your hand in the, and Ramsey was disappeared. Ah, there we are. Court. So Ramsey, could you take over from this point? You have to unmute.
Oh, is this okay? When I'm Court Fisher, I'm from the East Coast of the U.S. And I had the pleasure of having got a copy of the book, but of course I haven't had time to read it yet. But I'd like to continue with this theme about the line or the direction between ethics and politics. And one of the things that it seems to me it may be an extension of the demos that you are referring to, even comes from the Sangha tradition, or it comes from the Dharma tradition, which is to the extent that we as practitioners of whatever we choose to call ourselves, Buddhists, Dharma, I'll call myself a Dharma freak, okay? To the extent that there is value in our practice and in our community of practice, and what by practice I'm primarily referring to the various practices of meditation. I've always felt that that is a fundamental human value. And to the extent that it is a fundamental human value, that practice is a fundamental human value, it's a value that we wish to extend to as many others as possible. And in fact, that's one way of expressing the Bodhisattva vow. And you can't do that. You cannot extend the opportunity to maximize the opportunity for that practice unless you are involved in a political practice, because there are so many barriers in to extending that opportunity for the maximum number of people to be able to participate in this practice. And we, that's...
Come back on this, Winton.
Yeah, but we haven't come to the question yet.
I'm sorry. I'm being too long-winded. I just want to assert that there is a direct line between the ethics and the politics.
Yeah.
That is, there's a direct line between the practice and the politics that enables the extension of the practice to the largest number of people.
Well, yes, I completely agree. I mean, and this is one of the important points that Stephen has made in his writing, is about the primacy of the ethic of care, of appamada, in Buddhist practice. So in as much as we're learning the ethics of learning about the primacy of care and extending that care out, then we are connecting what we do on the cushion with what we do out on the agora, out in the public domain. And one of the things I expect a bit of pushback from with the book is that I dedicated the book to Ernst Wigforss, who, when I first came across him, he was a absolutely critical political thinker from the late 1920s to really until his death in the 70s, and the man behind the social democratic breakthrough in Sweden. Was, when I first came across him, I thought, this man is everything you would expect in a bodhisattva. He has universal care. He is incredibly articulate, and he is indefatigable. He was not only the greatest theoretician of his time, he was the greatest orator. And he wasn't a great orator in the way Donald Trump might imagine himself to be, but he instead of insulting his audience's intelligence, he actually complimented it by saying, I'm going to take you through a thought experiment. Stay with paid attention. And I spoke, when I was actually researching this character, I met a whole lot of old timers, old workers in Sweden who said hearing Wigforss at a big public meeting or on the radio, which was the new mass medium at the time, changed my life. It was the most extraordinary statement about a man who was really just an academic, and who decided that his ethics were so important, they had to be taken out into the public domain. And so, there's no either or. I'm not suggesting you were suggesting that, but a lot of people, I imagine, would say, but I'm helping the world by honing my meditation practice. It's not an either or proposition. If you're honing your meditation practice, you should be developing an impulse to get out there and join the school kids today in their strike for the climate emergency.
Thank you, Winton. Winton, we have a question from Brad Parks. He states, you describe secular Dharma as aiming at a non-religious approach to human life. Can you speak in that context to your resonance to the practice of secular faith as described in the writing of Martin Hägglund?
Well, how long have you got? In fact, the Dharma talk I gave just a few hours ago was on secular faith. I think it's a very important concept of his. He's using faith in its original meaning, going back to Aristotle, and for that matter, going back to Gautama, who talked about the 5 powers, the first of which is Saddha, which is essentially faith in the way Hägglund talks about it. Although Hägglund is not a Buddhist and is probably unaware of this, but it's the way Aristotle also talked about it as a practical commitment. So most of us in the common, if we just thinking in popular terms, think if we're non-religious, that means we don't have a faith. But he's saying, yes, if a faith is a commitment, which is usually preceded by some sort of conversion experience where we think a particular ideal or a particular goal is life-changing. We really want to put everything into this. That is what faith is. And for secular faith means that the object of that faith is this life, the title of his book, and this life is the life of a vulnerable, mortal, fragile, but resourceful being. This is what we are. So, and everything that matters to us really, our closest relationships, our projects are about things that are equally time-bound, equally of this world, equally subject to failure. And this is what we put our faith in. This is what we commit to. This is what we demonstrate fidelity to, which is another word for faith, really. This is what Hägglund is getting at. I think it's probably the central concept in his book, although there's a really interesting road to travel to get there and then where you go from there. It's an excellent book, I think, for secular Dharma practitioners or secular Dharma freaks. I highly commend it.
Thank you, Winton. Well, now we've got 3 questions coming up and only a few minutes left, so you need many to be brief. Tricia, Cersei, could you unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, I'll try to be very quick. This is kind of a follow-up on this Hägglund question, because my question relates to Hägglund's book. But just a quick comment is I noticed his book also is broken up into 2 parts, the secular faith part and then the political part. And so my question is about that, is about how you view Hägglund's, his move from how this idea of secular faith applies in the political sphere. And then just a quick comment that I was really struck in that book, how he ends the first part of the book, essentially, to my reading, saying as a summary of what Stephen says, that it's an ethic of care that we're looking at in this commitment to this secular faith. And I thought, well, that's just amazing, because I realized when he talks about Buddhism, it doesn't appear that he's, I don't know, aware of Stephen's take on these things, or the secular Buddhism at all. It didn't seem to me. He looks at it from this very traditional view and kind of criticizes it from that point. But my question really is about how you view the jump that he makes from the secular faith to the political sphere.
Well, it seems to me it's not so much a jump as a steady progression, and he ends up with an advocacy of democratic socialism, and he doesn't really. I mean, the slightly unsatisfactory aspect of the book that he doesn't talk about how that transition might work. In fact, I've had a little bit of private correspondence with him about that. So now I think we're both interested in the transition issue. Because obviously, in the West now, neoliberalism is still the reigning dogma and ideology for policymakers. And we have to get out of that. Yeah. And there are really interesting signs going on in civil society that are indicating that a transition is underway, particularly in the way people who have investment in pension funds are demanding that they divest from fossil fuels. And neoliberal governments say, you can't do that. That's out of order. the pension funds have got to maximise profit, and at least in this country, the people who are running the pension funds are saying, "Go to hell." You know, we are going to demand divestment from fossil fuels, and this is a classic way in which civil society is bearing down on political decision makers, and also tending to socialise the capital market. And that seems to me to be the really a linchpin of how this transition can occur. And it has precedents going back into the 20, 30 years.
Thank you. One very last question. Barbara Haynes is more of a comment than a question. My heritage is small Christian breakaway groups that left Europe in the 1600s and thought they were starting a new way of practicing Christianity in America, Quakers and Mennonites. One can blame them for the fact that they're no longer terribly interesting to people now, but do you feel that the act of breaking away from a, quote, world religion, unquote, is really what made them effective at first? Rather, was it their qualities of leadership, their humility and their acceptance that a flat social order works that brought them to life? Winton, please, can you be quick on that one? We're coming up to the end.
Well, I think the Puritans left a very mixed legacy, but one of the interesting aspects of it in the US was and I think it had antecedents in those those religious dissidents, was anarchism in the US and its way of trying to create alternative societies. I think some of those have been quite interesting. You know, there's various novels that have been written about particular pockets in US where they have tried to practice, the better aspects of Christian ethics. But I don't think it's such a direct legacy back to them these days.
Okay, Winton, thank you. And apologies to Sean. It doesn't look like we're going to be able to fit your question in and call for your comment. But everybody can read them in the chat. I'd like to say thank you, Winton, for writing this book and for sharing all these thoughts with us. I'm sure we're all going to find it very useful. Thank you for Stephen in France. Mille fois merci for turning up this morning and for engaging Winton into very interesting questions. Now, I'll just give it a plug. You can order this book at your local bookstore. You can also buy it online. But if you go to the Tuwhiri website, postage is included to wherever you live. Just a quick point that it looks like it's going to be translated into other languages. And we're talking to at least one group in Asia that wants to translate Revamp already into their language. Jim Champion, who I think is on the call, is producing a series of questions for a Dharma book reading group. And can I leave you with the last final thought from reputedly Margaret Mead, but that's a bit in doubt. Never doubt that, it's a message for Stephen here, never doubt that a small organized group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And with that real bit of positivity, I'll just say thank you to everyone for coming along today and taking part. And we do hope to get this video up online on YouTube at some point in the next week or so.
If I could just thank you, Ramsey, for putting this all together, and especially to thank Stephen for his provocative questions, but also for having really got secular Dharma up and running over the last 20 years. I think, Stephen is a very central figure in all this, and I'd like to acknowledge that.